Greetings all, Dr. X here. Today's lecture comes from Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Class, a textbook by Healy, Stepnick, and O'Brien. I'm going to cover chapter 1 in today's lecture about diversity in the United States. So first of all, what I want you to focus on is understanding from the reading what a minority group is. So the textbook authors do a really good job of discussing patterns of disadvantage and inequality that come with minority group status in the United States. So what they present is a definition of minority groups that includes information about characteristics. So one of the most important defining characteristics for a minority group is an issue of race, religion. Socioeconomic status can also indicate a minority group in the United States. Now, there are variable patterns of inequality. So inequality comes in various forms. Sometimes it comes in exploitation. Sometimes it's slavery. There is even evidence of genocide that takes place. So minority or subordinate groups have less of what society values. So minority groups can have less money, they can have less status, less power, or no power versus that of the majority group. There is a pattern, and that pattern is a result of actions by the core dominant group. So those people with power usually are the majority group. And so as you're going through doing the readings for this week, I want you to pay particular attention to what gets defined in the pattern as advantage or disadvantage, and those things that are seen as equality or inequality. Also, I'd like you to pay attention to the visible characteristics or visible traits they talk about when it comes to minority groups. So there is this self-conscious social unit, there are strong intra-group bonds, solidarity, there's this feeling of coming from different worldviews, or there's data actually to support people can see things in different ways coming from different worldviews. What sets members of the group apart are attributes like race versus ethnicity. So I want you to pay particular attention in your reading the difference that the authors give between the definitions of a race versus an ethnicity. And when we look at it, there's this creation of historical and social processes within the larger society as well as within the groups themselves. So what are those patterns of inequality that the authors talk about? Well, social stratification or stratification is one of those things. Stratification is the system of unequal distribution of those resources that are valued by society. And so what we can see in the United States is there is stratification that happens around race, around class, around gender. There is social stratification, economic stratification. So there is this history of unequal distribution of valued resources within the society. And so we can see that happening with segregation. We can see that happening with the way in which women have access to resources at a different rate than men do. And so as you're going through and doing your readings this week, I'd like you to pay attention to those patterns of inequality around stratification. Social classes consist of people who have similar levels of access to, again, those resources, those goods, those services that are seen as valuable in the society. For this semester, we'll be using the term social class as we look into and investigate those distinctions that are made around levels of access. The theoretical perspective I wanted to briefly cover in this week's lecture is from Kimberly Crenshaw. So in sociology, Patricia Hill Collins talks a lot about it, but the original thought was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's this concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality is a factor whenever a power differential is present. Crenshaw and Hill Collins talk about it as the intersections of various forms of a person's identity. There's identity you have around gender, there's identity around race, identity around ethnicity. There are all these ways in which we are socialized to understand who we are in the world. And what they're arguing is there's no one time when it's just one identity that impacts your status. It's instead the intersection of those identities that really gives us a better picture of the experience of people. And then minority group status, the authors argue that it limits access to wealth, income, property, prestige, and power. It has a correlation with social class, but it may be different from an individual social reality. For example, just because one individual of a particular minority group has prestige or owns property or has high income, it doesn't mean that one person is representative of the whole minority group. Unfortunately, what happens in our society is that sometimes people do equate one person's experience and then say that's the experience of all people within that minority group. Gender is also introduced in this chapter. Gender roles are societal expectations regarding the behavior, attitudes, and personality traits of men and women. So as you're doing your readings this week, what you'll find is that gender and inequality are correlated. So patriarchy is one of the terms you'll find out about, and that's about male domination. And sexism refers to the belief systems that label women as inferior or rationalize the lower status of women in the society. Finally, you'll see concepts of discrimination and prejudice discussed. So discrimination is the unequal treatment of a person based on his or her group membership. And prejudice, as we'll define it for this class, prejudice is the tendency of an individual to think about other groups in negative ways. And the book, I think, does a really good job of distinguishing that. So the book will talk about thinking versus actions, feelings versus doing. Prejudice, and describes prejudice as an individual trait, discrimination as the individual trait. But then it talks about ideological racism as a group or societal trait, and institutional discrimination, again, as a group or societal trait. And so in your textbook, where it talks about thinking and feeling, prejudice becomes something that is in the thinking or feeling realm, but then taking action on that prejudice fits with discrimination. So discrimination, again, unequal treatment of a person based on their group. There is ideological racism, and that's a systemic belief that asserts that a particular group is inferior. And so when we look at racism within the United States, part of what we're dealing with is an ideological sense of racism. There's also institutional discrimination that's talked about, societal equivalent to individual discrimination. And it refers to patterns of unequal treatment based on group membership, and it's built into the daily operations of society. And so an example of that would be the way in which historically we can see racial segregation in the school system, social class distinctions in school systems, those divisions where certain schools get access and other schools don't, where certain races have access and others don't. Unequal ways of being treated in society are an example of institutional discrimination. Public schools, the criminal justice system, and political or economic institutions can operate in ways that can discriminate against some groups and disadvantage its members. And so the key takeaway is understanding what institutional discrimination is as part of this week's readings. Okay, those are a couple of key concepts I wanted to point out to you as you're continuing your reading in Chapter 1 this week. Thanks so much. Have a good week.